So today, the Hub is partnering with IGRSJ to host the final presentation in this year's How Can We Get Trained series. Today's presentation is on podcasting as an academic genre, and it features Hannah McGregor. If you're here and you listen to podcasts, you probably listen to Hannah's podcast, Secret Feminist Agenda. It's very popular. Hannah has made the feminist agenda not so secret through her entertaining, smart, and thoughtful podcast, which is an inspiration to all scholars trying to share their ideas in a more public-facing mode. In addition to being a podcaster extraordinaire, Hannah is an assistant professor in the publishing program at SFU and the author or editor of many articles on humanities scholarship, teaching and learning, periodical studies, and digital humanities. When I brainstormed with the Hub RAs, who are here, Lisa and Sydney, and with our staff person Heather, about whom we could invite to present about podcasting in an academic context, basically we just all agreed, Hannah. She's given presentations in standing room only rooms at UBC several times over the past few years, and we're delighted that she's agreed to visit us again. So please join me in welcoming Dr. Hannah McGregor.
Thank you, Mary. I really appreciate the invitation. I forgot my tea. Okay, let me grab my slides, which are here. There we go. So what I'm going to do today is talk you through a little bit, very briefly, sort of how I came to be somebody who does most of my scholarship in and on podcasting, because it was kind of an accident. So I'll tell you a little bit of that story, play you a little bit of some of my own podcasts, just to sort of set the tone. But then we're going to move on. I'm going to chat a little about why I think podcasting is a really good fit for publicly engaged scholarship, and the work that I've been doing on incorporating peer review into scholarly podcasting. I'm going to try to keep things on the tighter side because I would really like to know what questions you have. This is, in a lot of ways, a more theoretical presentation than I often give on this work. I've got sort of two sets of slides, and one is like, okay, what's an audio recorder? And this one's more like peer review. How are we thinking about what scholarship is? But if you have questions that are like, but what's an audio recorder? We can totally talk about those more sort of practical aspects. I'm always happy to do that. So, who knows what this slide is supposed to mean? That's because the second part is called Why Podcasting, and so I retconned this great title, What Podcasting? So, in 2015, I was a postdoctoral fellow in English and Film Studies at the University of Alberta. And I was doing pretty conventional scholarship on the history of periodicals in Canada. I mean, it's thrilling scholarship to me, but you know, it's like literary historical scholarship that I was publishing in conventional journals. And then one day I was hanging out with my friend Marcel, who's a PhD candidate at U of A. We were chatting about how much we both missed reading for pleasure. So we decided that we were going to start a friendship project. Anybody else only able to maintain friendships through projects, right? It's like when you're an academic, you're like, no time for fun, everything has to be a job. So we decided we were going to start this friendship project, which was we were going to reread all of the Harry Potter books together. And Marcel, who had a bit of a background in producing campus radio, which he had done when she was a student at McGill and then a little bit at Guelph as well, suggested that we make a podcast out of it. And neither of us had any practical podcasting experience. I was and continue to be a passionate listener to podcasts, but we really genuinely did not know what we were doing. So we sat down to record the first episode with a couple of bottles of wine, a lot of chips. Most of our first podcast was fueled by wine and chips. We had to take, actually, Marcel found out she was pregnant the day after we recorded our first episode. So for that first 9 months, it's Marcel eating chips and me drinking wine. It's a good idea. And we started to record. We recorded using a single Zoom H4 audio recorder and one microphone plugged into it that we passed back and forth because we only had the one microphone. It ended up being a kind of accidentally feminist method because it meant we couldn't talk over each other. We had to wait until we literally were holding the mic before we could talk. So the podcast that we made is called Witch Please. And Witch Please is a sort of goofy, fun, feminist exploration of the Harry Potter series. And because I love to give you a sense of what a newbie podcaster produces, this is the first episode.
Welcome, listeners, friends, witches, wizards, muggles, warlocks, and hags, squibs, and everybody else. We're all equal. Welcome to Witch Please, the inaugural podcast in which Marcel Cosman and Hannah McGregor, that's me, talk about our feelings and thoughts about the Harry Potter series.
We found the song off freemusicarchive.org.
We're there, we're live at you 100% for the actual content of what it is that we're doing right now.
We're going to do great. Marcel provides the structure, and I provide the content. So we've divided this inaugural recording into 6 segments to help keep us on track.
So you can really hear we're like making this up as we go along. We're like, segments, yeah. Podcasts have segments. Well, there were podcast segments. And you can hear like it's fuzzy. We're recording in a living room. We don't know yet how noise reduction software works. We're really DIYing this situation. But what ended up happening, maybe 4 or 5 episodes in, we started to like pick up listeners who weren't our friends. And then maybe 3 or 4 months in, our friend Derek Mason, who is a professor of children's literature at the University of Calgary, wrote us an email and was like, hey, I'm new faculty, I've got this grant to bring in visiting speakers. Do you want to come and be visiting speakers and talk about your like radical experimental public pedagogy work? And we were like, sorry, our what? You mean our drunk podcast? And it was kind of a revelation for us to realize that the thing that we were doing was a form of public pedagogy. We were ready to not be taken seriously. I think still probably a lot of people don't take us seriously. We've just increasingly realized that that's fine. So fast forward a couple of years, the job that I got at Simon Fraser University, I got primarily because of my podcasting work. The department's really interested in innovative open access scholarship. And one of the first projects that I wanted to start on was to make a new podcast. So I got a grant, SHIRK Insight Development Grant with Wilfrid Laurier University Press to figure out a way to develop more formally a scholarly podcast, particularly with the goal of experimenting with a peer review process. And so we had this structure in mind. We were like, we're going to make, it'll be maybe a 5 episode, like a short run podcast. It will be in a sort of NPR style, like audio documentary, and I'll make an episode and then I'll give it to the press and the press will send it out for peer review and then I'll revise it and resubmit it and blah, blah, blah. And in a year and a half we'll publish them and be like, look, peer reviewed podcasting. And then meanwhile, unrelated, I started making Secret Feminist Agenda. Partly because I already owned the URL and I thought it was funny, and also partly because I had just arrived at a new institution, and those of you who have changed institutions a lot, you've probably experienced this. I felt wildly isolated in my new institution. I had had a very particular kind of academic community before that I was struggling to find in a new city, a new discipline, a new space, and I thought, well, I have experience with podcasts as friendship projects. I'll start a new friendship project, but this one's about conning people into being my friend. So I'll start a podcast where the premise is I interview interesting feminists, and then I have an excuse to cold email the interesting people in my new city and be like, I make a podcast, you want to come on it? I record it in my living room. It's cool and normal. And it worked great, and most of my friends in Vancouver are people I interviewed on this podcast now. So, recommendation. Start a podcast to make friends. So after a few months when Siobhan, my collaborator at Wilfrid Laurier University Press, and I were talking about what the podcast was going to be, I was like, cool, so I was thinking like a publishing history kind of thing, and she was like, I thought Secret Feminist Agenda was going to be the podcast we peer reviewed. I was like, don't be absurd, Siobhan, it's not scholarly. It's just me, a scholar, talking to other scholars about our scholarship. That's not scholarship. I'm still figuring this out. So we decided we were going to make Secret Feminist Agenda our pilot project, which meant we had to totally scrap our original plan for how we were going to approach peer review, because I was already publishing episodes on a weekly basis, which peer review absolutely cannot catch up with. So I'll talk to you a little bit more later on about what approach we ended up taking, but just give you a flavor of Secret Feminist Agenda.
Hi, I'm Hannah McGregor, and this is Secret Feminist Agenda. I'm so excited to be bringing you the first official episode of this new podcast dedicated to the mundane, nefarious, and even insidious ways we enact feminism in our daily lives. Before I introduce you to this week's guest, I want to tell you what my Secret Feminist Agenda is this week.
So the first guest for that project was Zine Yao, who at the time was a postdoctoral fellow here at UBC. Zine and I also still only had one microphone at that point, and we went and hung out on a park bench, and I asked her to tell me what she thought about feminism. So there's, a theme here to how I start my projects. But I also wanted to point to this, which now that I have started to become somebody who people think of as a scholar who makes podcasts, I was invited to join the Spoken Web partnership to help them make a podcast. Spoken Web is a SHRP partnership grant-funded collaborative project that is dedicated to digitizing and circulating audio recordings of literary readings in Canada. So it is about the sort of how we grapple with audio artifacts as literary scholars. And so for obvious reasons, podcasting is a great fit, both to sort of circulate the interesting archival findings, because it is tricky to circulate audio archives via print scholarship, but also to start to experiment with, if we're doing scholarship about audio, can we do audio scholarship about audio? So this is a really different kind of project for me. I am the sort of head of the podcast, but the actual episodes are made by collaborators across the whole network. So we have episodes that have come out of UBC Okanagan, out of Concordia University. We have forthcoming episodes coming out of University of Alberta, out of SFU, of course. And so there's a different kind of approach, and we're trying to use this as an opportunity to let people experiment with a lot of support, with a lot of sort of structure in making their first scholarly podcast. And it has been an interesting challenge, because getting busy academics to do something that is not already part of their workflow is incredibly difficult. So I'm happy to also chat about this project if this is something you're interested in as well, this sort of larger collaborative research output. But yeah, just have a little taste of this too.
What does literature sound like? What stories will we hear if we listen to the archive? Welcome to the Spoken Web podcast, stories about how literature sounds. My name is Hannah McGregor, and each month I'll be bringing you different stories of Canadian literary history and our contemporary responses to it, created by scholars, poets, students, and artists from across Canada. I'm so excited to...
Who knows what I'm excited about? Okay, so I make a lot of podcasts. I have a fourth podcast that I didn't feature here. It's called Bad Choices, that's about The Good Place, which is genuinely non-scholarly, except insofar as I insist on talking about scholarship in every episode, because I'm unbearable. So let's take a step back and talk about why, that slide's in the wrong place. Wait. I see what's happening. I've got a display issue. Why podcasting? Great, let's do that. Cool. So one of the first things that really excites me about the potential of podcasting as scholarship is that it is an inherently open access medium. We are struggling in the world of scholarly communication to take a whole system that was built to be closed and figure out how to make it open. And there is this part of it that is like, you know, you can make a journal open, but how do you actually make anybody who's not a scholar even read it in the first place? And the lovely thing about podcasting, it is an inherently open medium, and not only is it inherently open in the sense that it's not paywalled, it's actually part of this original glorious vision of the open web that we had back in the early 2000s before we sold out to corporations and their secret algorithms. So podcasting, the basic technology of podcasting is something called an RSS feed. It stands for really simple syndication. And the logic of it is the ability to create a stable URL that automatically updates with new posts. Does anybody remember back when you would subscribe to the RSS feeds of blogs? And there were these like feed aggregators that you could use, and you would tell it all of the feeds that you wanted, and it would just compile. It was like making your own Facebook, but like you actually chose what went on it, and no, it wasn't pay to play, it was you subscribed to stuff, you curated it personally, and everything just automatically updated when a new episode popped up. Which is, it sounds kind of like a wild fantasy in the era of all of these pay-to-play, corporate, algorithm-driven platforms, but that's literally still how podcasting works. We've got all of these I call them podcatchers, like all of these sort of platforms that you go to access podcasts, but those are just databases. They are databases of existing RSS feeds. There are no barriers to anybody who wants to submit a new podcast RSS feed. Nobody's, like Apple Podcasts is not curating, they're not hiding stuff. They make a display page at the front, an actual human makes that, where you can sort of go and see like what's interesting and new this month. But otherwise it's just, you just search and find stuff that's in the database and start listening. We mostly find out about them via word of mouth, and we subscribe to them using this like really old model. And lots of companies are trying to come along and like figure out how to like monetize things and paywall things and use algorithms to shove advertising in things. But it's not working well with podcasting because podcasting lives so inherently in this old model of the web. And because it is an open model, it is a non-corporately owned model, it is a beautiful model to think about for making genuinely open and accessible scholarship. Because it is built on this model, it is also not totally eaten up by professional corporate studio production. Yes, there are more and more we hear all of these deals where Spotify is buying Gimlet for like $1 billion, and it's like, oh, there's finally big money in podcasting. But the reality is podcasting is still a space where an amateur or indie podcast can get significant traction, and that can become somebody's living. There are a lot of people who are professional podcasters and have been for a decade, and who are doing that work telling interesting and responsible stories. And you look to an independent network like, say, Radiotopia, which is producing really remarkable audio storytelling in a sustainable way that's sort of listener supported, still remains totally open, they don't paywall anything, and it really sort of demonstrates that there still is this kind of potential for radical creation within the world of podcasting. I include this is a quote from a piece by, I just put my hand over the mic like a real professional. It's like, this is a secret. This is an article from Nicholas Qua, basically about it's characteristic of an argument you're seeing a lot right now, which is podcasting used to be this open and radical space, and that is over now. And articles like this have been coming out for about a decade, and they're going to keep coming out. People declare the end of indie podcasting like every 6 months or so, and yet it continues somehow to persevere. And I think that a big part of that is that it is so deeply embedded within that open web model that it is just really hard to take what people like about podcasting and transport it into more corporate platforms. This is just to troll bloggers. So in addition to all of the sort of like philosophical reasons why I think podcasting and scholarship go well together, there is also something inherent about podcasting as a medium that makes it a really great platform for the communication of complex ideas. And I think that has a lot to do with the way that podcast listeners tend to engage with podcasts, which is to say there are mobile technology that people listen to on portable audio devices, generally through headphones. And the function of that is that it creates this intense sense of intimacy with the podcast that you're listening to. Podcast listeners often talk about feeling like they know the hosts of their favorite podcasts. Like I text on a regular basis with a friend of mine about how these three brothers who host a bunch of podcasts we like are doing. We're like, oh, do you think he sounded a little anxious in the most recent episode? Like they are strangers. But we're used to, like we walk around with their voices in our heads when we're doing things that we would normally, like showering, going to the bathroom, going to bed, like in these sort of intimate, private spaces of our lives, these voices are in our heads, and it can really create this sense of closeness, of proximity. This is from Glenn Weldon, who's one of the panelists for NPR's Pop Culture Happy Hour, talking about what he calls the one-way intimacy of podcasting. Sort of, I don't totally buy that it's inherently one-way, but I think this is lovely. He says, listening to a favorite podcast engenders a powerful sense of intimacy. You come to know the host's tastes, their tics, the phrases they overuse, as they unthinkingly dole out tiny incremental parcels of information about their personal lives. You realize one day that your brain has unthinkingly constructed exhaustive virtual dossiers on each of them, which sounds a little murdery, but I think is actually quite lovely. And because there is this sort of sustained listening experience, right, that we will listen to them for hours at a time, on a commute, on a walk, alongside the sense of intimacy, podcast audiences tend to be really tolerant of deep dives into niche topics, difficult and complex and nuanced conversations, that there isn't this expectation that we see maybe in other spheres of digital publishing that's like everything needs to be a picture or a listicle or a soundbite. It's like, no, podcasting's like an immersion medium. Like you can really spend time inside of a podcast, and you can really ask your audience to sort of go on a journey with you. And I do think that's a very particular thing about how podcast listeners engage with the medium. And for that reason, I do think it's well suited to the kinds of public humanities scholarship that we're interested in doing. This originally said two great tastes, and then I was like, I'm not comfortable calling either podcasting or academia great. They're fine. But I do think that they lend themselves to one another. And this is not a sort of a revelatory claim. In fact, the link between podcasting and universities came really, really early with I think it was at Duke University, that when iPods were brand new, Apple basically gave the campus a bunch of iPods to experiment with using podcasting for pedagogy. So there's a long history of using podcasts to enhance the classroom experience, to say, let students listen to lectures on the go, or to sort of, amplify teaching material. It has been slower for podcasting to be associated with research. This is from a literature review that one of my first research assistants, who was at the time a master's student here at UBC, wrote about the relationship between podcasting and scholarship, and I still think it's a great, well-worded intervention. She wrote, podcasting has historically been viewed as a part of the teaching work of researchers rather than the practice or distribution of scholarship. Little scholarship covers the use of podcasts by academics to communicate with their peers or distribute research, although this work is being done. The lack of attention to scholarly podcasts outside the classroom presents a strange picture in which researchers seem to value podcasts for distributing knowledge only to students. Podcasting is an accessible distribution strategy, and some among the academy have clearly learned how to use it. So why is there so little attention paid to using podcasts to supplement research? Which I think remains, she wrote this a couple of years ago, it certainly remains the case. And what has become increasingly clear to me is that there are lots of scholars who are secretly making podcasts because we're nerds with deep passions about weird niche topics. Like, of course we're making podcasts. The problem is that most people are not putting them on their CVs. Most people are not talking about them at conferences. Most people treat them as a shameful secret or a side hustle because we don't take them seriously, right? Which gets to the heart of the way that in a lot of contexts of humanities research in particular, publicly engaged means unserious. And if you are doing your scholarship in a medium that is accessible, engaging, public, informal, that indicates a lack of seriousness of that work. And I think that's a big sort of point of tension for the larger embrace of podcasting as a form of scholarship. Which gets me to what I think are the big barriers to people really adopting this. It's like a tiny list and then a big quote. So it says technology, right? Getting people, again, busy people to figure out how to use a new technology is hard. Of course, when you are busy, learning to do a new thing is like the last thing you want to do. Expertise, similar, right? Not only do you need access to the technology, you also need to learn how to actually do the thing. These are, for anybody who's worked in digital humanities, these will be wildly familiar to you. That you're like, we have all of these amazing new tools, and people are like, when am I going to learn that? Never. Time. Oh, they're all related, look at that. But the one that I have particularly been focusing on in my work is the question of credit, which is tied in for me with the politics of credit, the politics of value, the politics of what we take seriously at the university as work. So this is from a great piece by Sarah Bond and Kevin Gannon about publicly engaged scholarship. They wrote, for too long, academe treated such work, public-facing scholarship, as lesser than, as not prestigious enough to count for real college faculty members. Considered in terms of impact and reach, however, this scholarly work, and make no mistake, it is scholarly, resonates far more widely and deeply than much of the traditional, and in large part, literally inaccessible projects prized by a more limited view of legitimate scholarly activity. As we broaden our notions of what counts as scholarship, academics must find effective ways to assess these pivotal forms of outreach, whether it's public writing, community initiatives, or open access digital projects. So that's really crucial. If we're going to value this work, we need to figure out in functional ways, like, well, how do we value it? Like, how do we take this seriously? You know, in some contexts, all of my podcasting work would be considered service, right? It's publicly engaged work, it's public talks, it is something that is sort of structurally really similar to, say, organizing a conference, right? It's work that people recognize matters, but that would be sort of heaped over in service, and it would be like, cool, that's great, we like it, but also please write 17 journal articles so we know that you're a serious scholar. I am really lucky to be in a department that sort of puts its money where its mouth is in terms of valuing open scholarship, and that takes my podcasting work seriously as part of my research load as a faculty member. And so I'm trying to use that position. I've been holding this water bottle for like 3 minutes, I'm so thirsty. I'm trying to use that position to do research and infrastructure building that is going to make it more possible for other scholars to take up this kind of publicly engaged work. So, how do we do that? Step one, we work closely and collaboratively with the many people in our fields whose job it already is to think about things like publicly engaged work. So we work with our libraries, we work with our scholarly publishers, we work with museum curators, we work with people who are academics and who are also in the business of thinking about circulating ideas. Foundational to all of this work for me has been an ongoing concerted collaboration with a university press editor who knows exactly how the sort of project of accrediting scholarship works at a much more granular level than I understood. With the next iterations of this project, we're going to expand to collaborating more actively with librarians, because our next big priority is to make scholarly podcasts searchable and discoverable within traditional scholarly sort of search engines and research discovery platforms. So So we're going to work with librarians to figure out how that's going to work, right? We don't have to reinvent the wheel here. There are lots of people with a huge amount of expertise who are already grappling with exactly these problems. The next thing is that we've really had to go back to the process of peer review and rethink how it was going to work almost from the ground up. That we had to say, is peer review something we still value? Yeah, we think that there's something useful there. Okay, then what does it look like when you're asking people to meaningfully peer review a podcast? It can't look exactly the same as the peer review for a journal article because they're different media. So, let me tell you a little bit about the peer review process for Secret Feminist Agenda. I already mentioned by the time we decided Secret Feminist Agenda was going to be our major sort of pilot podcast for the SSHRC grant, that I was already like 2 months into making it. There were a bunch of episodes already posted. It was too late. The cat was already out of the bag. So we decided that I would make the podcast season by season, and that we would peer review it retroactively by season. So we decided semi-arbitrarily that a season would be 15 interviews. That meant in season 1, when I was doing an interview every episode, season 1's 15 episodes, but seasons 2 and 3 are 30 episodes because I cut down to doing an interview every second episode. That's sort of how we decided. I'll never drink water ever again. That's how we decided to sort of chunk off the seasons. And then once I was done making and publishing a season, I would then sort of send it to the press. It was fundamentally unnecessary to send it to the press because it was published already. But what I did do is sort of take the MP3s of all the final episodes and put it in a Dropbox folder for them so they were easy to find. And at that point, the press initiated an open peer review process. So we decided, because podcasting is an inherently open medium, and that it was fundamentally impossible to anonymize my work, because it's my voice talking, that we were going to make all of the peer review open to sort of fit the ethos of the project as a whole. Siobhan McMenemy, my collaborator, like I said, at Wilfrid Laurier University Press, has talked a little bit about the process of finding people willing to engage in the open peer review process. She had one person explicitly turn down peer reviewing the podcast because it was going to be open, because they felt uncomfortable with the idea of doing open peer review, but everybody else has been really comfortable with it, has been totally willing to sort of embark on this journey with us. So the peer review is, once sort of the way the process works is Siobhan finds the peer reviewers, gives them some time and a questionnaire sheet, which is standard for the peer review of book manuscripts as well, some sort of guided questions, and gives them some time to respond. Once they have sent her their responses, I get a chance to read them and write a response of my own, and then the 2 peer reviews and my response to them all go up on the press website. And they're all there now. There's 3 seasons of peer review now up on Wilfrid Laurier University Press website. The 3rd season, at the prompting of our peer reviewers, who said that not only did they want their peer review to be open, but that in fact it felt weird to do peer review about a feminist podcast primarily motivated by conversation in isolation. They were like, we would like to talk to each other as part of our peer review. So the 3rd round of peer review for the 3rd season is 2 of our peer reviewers recording a podcast episode where they talk to each other about Secret Feminist Agenda, and then the response to it is a podcast episode where Siobhan and I talk through our response to that peer review and to the project as a whole. So we got deeply meta at the end there. And then the next stage, which is sort of just part of how this press at least operates, is that Siobhan will be bringing the entire project to the Wilfrid Laurier University Press Board of Governors and saying, like, are you comfortable with us now declaring this podcast to be a piece of peer-reviewed scholarship under the imprint of this press, which is sort of the last step that we're waiting to make it official. So I'm going to conclude by sharing a little bit with you out of these peer reviews, since they're here and open. they're really long, and so I'm just I grabbed a few screenshots that sort of stuck with me that can pull out some of the key themes and how people responded. One of the things that I love about these open peer reviews is how informally people ended up responding, which I think is prompted by the sort of informality of the podcast itself, the sort of tone in the podcast. So this is Cheryl Ball, who is a digital publishing expert, who is the editor of Kairos, which is an experimental open access journal, so she's obviously had expertise in this kind of work. The tone of her peer reviews throughout have been very like, yes, of course this is scholarship, what a dumb question, stop asking. Like very frustrated with the entire endeavor. Like, oh, we just need to stop thinking about scholarship in such traditional ways, like boring questions, move on, which I always found really hilarious. But Cheryl brought up something that has ended up being a really important question for me, which is how do you figure out when a podcast is done? Like a book has a clear end point, right? A journal article has yes and no, but at some point you're finished the book and then the book is published and then there you go, it's the book. But podcasting is a serial medium, and not like in the same sense as a scholarly journal, because I make all of the episodes. And as Cheryl points out, this is a massive amount of content, and I do not understand how she is pulling this off on the regular, which I thought was really funny. The answer is that it was unsustainable, and for the 4th season I've pulled back the production schedule, so I put an episode out every second week. But for those first 3 seasons, I was doing weekly episodes of this podcast, which was genuinely absurd. But it was a pilot project, so it's making it up as I go along. But I really appreciated this, this is not an intervention I have received in peer review before. It's an explicitly feminist intervention into the question of labor, right? So there's already a sense that this mode of peer review is inviting different kinds of feedback. The other peer reviewer for the first round was Amanda French, who, let's see, why did I pull this out? Oh yeah, she had a very different tone, which was rather than being like, of course this is scholarship, was like, yeah, okay, you just good luck transforming the university. So this is question 5, which is, do you take this seriously as an expression of scholarly research engagement? She wrote, I feel like this question is really asking, should this podcast count toward tenure? And I guess my answer is, sure, fine by me, good luck with that. It's the hardest I've ever laughed while reading peer reviews. And she said, look, something of this nature doesn't really fit into the usual triumvirate of research, teaching, service, but I think it's that triumvirate that's at fault. And this was another really significant intervention early in the project for me, was somebody saying, when we start to think about how we're going to count non-traditional work, we might just have to rip this whole system apart. We might just have to say the 40-40-20 research, teaching, service model just doesn't make any sense. And we need to do away with it, which is a larger and harder question, but I think a really important intervention for thinking about publicly engaged scholarship, right? That we can't necessarily shoehorn it into the existing models we already have. And this is my response, which I have included here only to register the fact that I have never felt more nervous about receiving peer review than I did the first round of peer review that I got for this, because I have never felt more personally vulnerable in relation to scholarly work than I have in relation to Secret Feminist Agenda. Because I'm not talking about ideas in isolation, I'm talking about my body and my mental health and my relationships and my, how I as a human being am grappling with being a scholar. And so it felt like any negative feedback in the peer review was going to be a personal judgment about my value as a human being, which I'm normally pretty good about not receiving usual peer review in that way. When somebody's like, research this better, I'm not like, oh, you mean I'm terrible. But this felt so intimate and personal and vulnerable, and it was really remarkable to me to see the amount of care with which the work was received and with which these feminist scholars responded to the work. And I think the open peer review process really encouraged that kind of generative, and care-based approach to how people thought about the project that I was undertaking. Second round of peer review was Anna Palletti, who refused to answer the questions in any straightforward fashion, and instead sort of wrote a letter in response to the committee that began with this sort of self-narration. She basically was like, this doesn't make sense, you know, I'm a scholar of autobiography and genre and form and feminist life writing, and I don't want to just go through and like answer questions. I want to do this work in a form that makes sense to me, which would be the first of what turned out to be a bunch of interventions into the very question of the form of peer review that were pushed by our peer reviewers. And then this was also really interesting because she had a different kind of intervention into the question of category. So she writes here, several times whilst listening to the podcast, I wondered whether what McGregor was doing in Secret Feminist Agenda was more akin to teaching than to research. Given the scholarship teaching definition of the profession is underpinned by a binary logic of gender, masculinity is associated with research, femininity with teaching, I began to think that a possible scholarly contribution to feminism made by Secret Feminist Agenda is not to bring scholarship out from the confines of the university by publishing it differently, but to bring teaching as a praxis and ethics, a political action dedicated to education as a form of freedom out of the university. I was like, oh, this is the best peer review I've ever read. Just like all of these peer reviews are like short essays on the politics of scholarly production. And I find that a really exciting idea as well, to think about, you know, can certain modes of public humanities scholarship be in fact about arguing that the foremost job of the university is pedagogical rather than research-based, which I find also a really exciting intervention. And then the other peer reviewer for season 2 was Karla Rice, who came back in season 3. It's Karla Rice and Cheryl Ball are the, sorry, my slides look different than yours. Karla Rice and Cheryl Ball are the two who made the podcast episode for season 3. And what did I pull out here from Karla Rice? Oh yeah, she had a different way of thinking about sort of what kind of feminist project the podcast was engaged in. She sort of framed it within a larger feminist question of what kind of knowledge we value and how storytelling is a kind of knowledge making, that there's a whole feminist history of thinking about how do we value storytelling as a legitimate form of knowledge production. And one of the reasons why, oh yeah, and then there's my response. Who knows what I said? Oh, I've cried while reading peer reviews. But never happy tears. There we go. It's just escalating, like, we're getting more informal as we go, less formal as we go. Yeah, what I really want to highlight about these peer reviews is that when Siobhan and I decided this was going to be the podcast that we peer reviewed, I was really resistant to the idea that peer review would be valuable to me as a podcast maker. I understood it to be a kind of box checking, a kind of formal exercise that was about legitimating something whose locus of legitimacy for me did not lie in scholarly community, it lay in my listenership. Right? That's who I'm making the podcast for, that's who I'm responding to feedback from, that's who I care about, that's who I feel accountable to, is my listenership. Some of whom are academics, some of whom are not, but I don't distinguish their status as peers based on their institutional accreditation. They're my listeners, they're my community, they're who I'm making this work for. And so the idea that the peer review would be valuable kind of didn't occur to me. And I think like a lot of other scholars, I've had a lot of really bad, ungenerous peer reviews in my life that sort of gave me put a bad taste in my mouth for the process as a whole. But this process completely changed my mind about what peer review can be like. This was an opportunity to have engaged feminist scholars think deeply about the work that I was doing and offer me new ways to think about it, new methodological and theoretical frames through which to revisit my own project. They've pushed my thinking forward, they've made the work better, and I have come out as somebody who's like, peer review is incredible, we're just doing it wrong. Right? But there's this amazing potential, if we rethink the actual forms in which we do peer review, for it to be like this incredible form of mentorship that can sometimes, fall off in our careers once we leave grad school. This is my here's who I'm actually making this for. It's these just random global feminists. The top form of feedback that I get from listeners is that something about the podcast has made them feel less alone, or has made them stop questioning their own experience of the world, or has made them feel less gaslit in some institutional context they're operating in. And that's the most valuable thing I can possibly imagine my work doing, is to make somebody's life feel even incrementally less overwhelming. Seems significantly more important than a line on a CV. So here you go, here's our findings so far with this project. That podcasting as a medium is a fantastic opportunity for us to revisit and really break apart the conventions of how scholarly communication works. Right? That we're not just reading papers out loud into a microphone, that we can really do different kinds of work in this medium. And that when we do work in this medium, the engagement with that work increases significantly, really meaningfully. A tiny listenership to a podcast is 50 or 60 people, right? You can get that no problem. It's a tiny readership for a article in a humanities journal is 0, right? Which is the median number of citations for most humanities scholarship. So it just engages people more actively. Partnering with publishers and librarians is an ideal way to solve all of the problems that come with trying to sort of make scholarly podcasts and share them and accredit them and evaluate them. We're not going to make significant progress in rethinking the form scholarship takes until we revisit the breaking of our work into 3 implicitly hierarchicalized categories. That's going to be I know that's a thing that we're all probably already working on in some way, but that's really going to be at the heart of this work. And that one of the best ways that we can intervene into those categories is by demonstrating the value of work that doesn't fit readily into them. Showing the way that this work can do something exciting and transformative, and then being look, it's great, it doesn't fit into any of these categories, so we've got to rethink how we're evaluating things. This is the second last point, is sort of a tip of the hat to Kathleen Fitzpatrick's new book called Generous Thinking, which is a really, really wonderful reconsideration of the role of the university in sort of its relationship to the public in the 21st century, where she basically argues that we ourselves are responsible for the loss of faith in the university and humanities scholarship because we have walled ourselves off so totally from the communities who our work should be engaging in, and that it is time to really rethink the modes in which we are doing work so it is inherently public, that is public first, not public as an afterthought that comes at the end of a research project. And that one of the big parts of this work is always going to be pushing our institutions to take this work more seriously, to take open access more seriously, to take public work more seriously, and that really is going to be at the heart of a lot of the sort of larger work that we need to be doing in terms of the transformation of the university. The end. Why did PowerPoint put a bottle of glue beside my Twitter handle? That's fun, huh?
Any questions and comments for him?
Yeah.
I'm curious about your process for the transcripts. and making the podcast accessible? I'd like to hear a little more about that.
Yeah, so right now what we do for transcription is use an automated transcription service. I use Temi, which is a pretty good, reliable automation service. It's 10 cents a minute, and then I pay a research assistant to clean up the transcriptions because it's good but not perfect. The challenge that I've had, so I did not take transcription seriously enough in the first season at all. I was just like, oh yeah, at some point I'm going to transcribe this anyway. And I got an email one day from one of my listeners. This is like the best thing about doing public feminist scholarship is that like my listeners feel totally like they can critique me, like in a really good way. Not like so often I feel like as an academic people are like, you know, the university is such a closed off institution that I'm not allowed to talk back. But my listeners will absolutely email me and be like, hey, guess what, you fucked up again. And I'm like, no. So I got an email from a listener who was like, hey, you said you were going to do transcripts and then you never mentioned it again. And I feel like you're not taking it seriously, and I feel like that really undermines the whole ethos of this project that you're doing. And I was like, yeah, you know what? If there was somebody in my life who I was really close to, who was hearing impaired or deaf, it would have been a top priority, right? And the fact that it was not a top priority is just an indication of how deeply ableist my sort of default mode of operating is. And I was like, fuck, yes, absolutely. Transcripts now. Like, so I made it my, you know, my next priority and to try to be really transparent around it. What I haven't figured out how to do yet is get the transcripts up alongside the episodes. Because I can't, like I'm making the episodes usually like the day before they go out. Because it's like I'm just scrambling to get things done all the time. So there's no way to get them transcribed before they go up. So there's a delay of like maybe a month between when episodes go up and when transcripts go up. And the accessibility ideal is that they would go up simultaneously. And I have not figured out a way to make that work with my workflow. But what it would look like is me getting ahead of my own episode production so that I make the episodes more time before they air, so that there's time for the transcription. But then if I was doing that, the episodes wouldn't be as contemporary, because I'm often commenting on things that are happening right now. So it is a struggle. But sort of goal is to make sure that the transcriptions are coming out on a regular basis. And they end up costing me probably like $20 an episode, I would guess, between the sort of transcription service, which is like for an hour-long episode, $6, and then the labor, the human being.
That's really
labor and
interesting.
purchasing.
Thank you, and I appreciate that you do that, because I have a friend who's deaf. So that, like you said, the personal connection, she was like, I wish I could listen to podcasts.
Yeah.
And I said, well, I know one that you can read.
Yeah, and so we're trying to make sure with spoken web, we've incorporated that into the project right from the beginning so that the transcriptions come out faster. And then, I've done some research, like the ideal is that you sort of embed the transcripts in a way that people can listen and read along at the same time, because that is how a lot of people want to engage with them. That for a lot of people who have sort of reduced hearing, they still want to listen, they just need the transcript. Or like lots of other sort of cognitive needs, like there's lots of reasons why people find transcripts increase the accessibility. So that's the ideal. The downside is that transcripts are Googleable, which like the best thing about doing feminism in podcast form is that people can't Command F an audio file. So when I say shit that makes people mad, they can't find it because it's hidden in the worst place ever for misogynists, which is a woman's voice. Can't find my ideas, they're here inside the lady voice. But once you've made transcripts, then everybody can find it. But that's fine. I don't know.
I'm just wondering, I have a question about the peer review process, because it seemed like a lot of the feedback that you got from your peer reviewers was actually about the podcast as a medium rather than the content of the podcast, which makes sense given that this is a podcast, or it is a pilot.
Yeah.
But, let's say in an ideal world that this was widely accepted as a new form of producing scholarship and that, it regularly underwent peer review, how would you implement potential peer review on content that you might then have to like re-record the audio for, say, for example, or is that part of the process? Do you know what I mean?
I 100% know what you mean, because that's what, like, once we decided that we were going to peer review retroactively, that meant we had to get comfortable with the fact that none of the peer review would lead to revisions of already published episodes.
Okay.
And so I think about the peer review as an iterative process in which I use the feedback from one season to inform what I make in the next season. So the bits that I showed were the sort of more high-level conceptual stuff, but there's lots in there that was feedback about particular episodes, tone, structure, conversation, and that feedback included things like, I want you to talk about this, I want you to have this kind of guest, I had an issue with the way that you discussed this, and I want you to address it. And so, like, in season 2, there are episodes where I explicitly am like, hey, in this mini episode, I'm going to talk about this aspect of the peer review, and just like talk it through. So that I haven't gone back and edited, but I've sort of continued with each season to try to incorporate what I've learned from the peer review from the previous season, which is all like wildly unconventional, but like.
Can I ask a quick follow-up question? I'm just curious whether you do or what your thoughts are about the, because if we think of academic publishing as a contribution of new knowledge, how you differentiate like the production of knowledge from knowledge mobilization, saying, so this is open access and it's something that, is it about producing new knowledge or is it about extending sort of old knowledge to a wider audience? And it probably does a bit of both, but I'm just curious how you navigate that.
I think it does a bit of both. I think probably Secret Feminist Agenda as a project, the primary new knowledge that it creates is formal rather than content-wise. I think I am probably not producing a lot of new scholarly ideas. I think that what is new about it is the very sort of mode in which it is created. And there's a lot of interesting thinking in the peer review about the question of whether or not we agree that scholarship is the production of new knowledge. That if the sort of fetishization of the new within the university is necessarily always a good mode in which to operate. Because again, it then sort of takes pedagogy, it takes traditional knowledge, it takes like lots of categories of like very important knowledge work and is like, well, these don't count because these aren't this thing we've decided is what's real. So where our next stage with this project is to acquire some new podcasts, so sort of build out Wilfrid Laurier's like podcasting network. And I think those podcasts will be doing a bit more of that sort of producing new knowledge kind of thing. But it's part of the whole question of, I think the project of public humanities in general is like, do we de-emphasize the creation of new knowledge as the sort of only real mode of research production right now?
This is going to be very scattered and apologies. So I was thinking about transcripts, and so thank you for asking that question. And I was kind of curious by your saying, actually, the control F is a problem, because I was thinking about it, and this might not be the point at all, and I'm curious to see if you say, that's just not the point at all. I was thinking about like how, for students who are doing sort of traditional research in their institutional repository or in databases, it would be useful to have the transcripts there so that then students could be finding the podcast in another way in order to then cite the podcast in their scholarship. So is that, I mean, and again, that might not be the point, but like that seems like that would be a benefit of having the transcripts available. And so are they going into your institutional repository? Okay.
Yes and yes, right? So the primary goal of the transcripts was accessibility, not citability, but transcripts increase citability massively. And the question of how, like the team behind This American Life made this really interesting sort of beta tool that basically lines up your transcripts with your audio files so that people can search the transcript, grab chunks of text, and then sort of it will auto-clip the audio file that goes with it. And the goal was that to sort of, goal of that was to increase the shareability of podcasts. Because like on social media, we share like excerpts from articles that we've read that we loved in order to circulate those articles, but there's no easy way to do that with the podcast unless you have an audio editing suite and download an episode and like manually clip out a clip and then re-upload that to a web, like it's unshareable. So they've come up with a tool to do that, but it suggests in general that desire to sort of cite or quote or otherwise recirculate excerpts from podcasts is a challenge of the medium as a whole, and that transcripts are absolutely central to sort of incorporating podcasts into institutional repositories, and then ultimately if we want to make them searchable through like university library systems, that you're going to have the transcript attached to it.
So the sort of philosophical, I guess, part of the question then is like, if a student is finding a journal article that you've written, they don't need to have read like every other thing that you've written really to kind of like get a full story or like a full sense of your scholarship in that area.
Yeah.
But it seems odd to me to just sort of dip in through a keyword search, find a chunk of a podcast that's part of this larger series and conversation. Like, I'm just curious, like, how do you feel about, you know, the sort of student research magpie-ish, you know, just like finding a little tidbit and like moving it into the scholarship for something like this project?
Absolutely no idea because it hasn't happened
Okay.
yet. Like, because we're so, like, even as you're saying that, I'm like, I just can't imagine that being how people even find the podcast in the first place.
No.
Like, I know that Secret Feminist Agenda gets cited and used and taught, particularly because people tell me that they're using it. Or like, recently I got an email from an undergraduate student somewhere in America who wanted to share with me that they had done a research project about popular perceptions of cat ladies that was inspired by an episode that I made about cats. And they were like, here's my research report, I just wanted to send it to you. And I was like, thanks, this is great. Like, I don't know what to do with it, but I'm delighted. But so that, like, it's more common that people come in through the experience of listening and then figure out something to do with it. But like, I don't know, if people want to just like grab a quotable line, like, that seems fine.
Okay.
Like, what's that? Ah, yeah. Is that a good answer?
Yeah.
I had a question of my own, but maybe it's more of a comment. If any of you are faculty members, I would love you to take Hannah's point about trying to change the institution from within, because the Public Humanities Hub is trying to get the administration to rethink how this kind of public-facing work is assessed for tenure and promotion. And everybody very high up is all about public engagement, and everybody here is all about public engagement. But then there's what one of my colleagues calls the frozen middle. You need to talk to the frozen middle. And I have heard from my dean in arts that his committee about tenure promotion will take direction from the standards of assessing that happen at your departmental level. So if you talk to your department and you say, I'd like the annual report to have a section on public-facing work, I'd like the tenure criteria to include public-facing work, then you will change your department, and then the next level of assessment will acknowledge that. So there's a lot of work we can all do at the departmental level to shift this.
My colleague in publishing, Juan Pablo Elbring, who's the research director of the Public Knowledge Project, in his lab, which works on scholarly communication as well, did a sort of high-level research project looking at tenure and review documents in multiple different disciplines across institutions across North America to see if they anywhere mention publicly engaged work. And his finding was like, no, nowhere. Like, tenure documents do not mention public work. And we can talk all we want about the value of this work, but until we like actually write it into those processes, like, things aren't gonna change. Because when people sit down, generally our tenure documents are just really vague, And when people sit down to evaluate a file based on a vague tenure document, they're just going to import whatever values they already have. And a lot of the time those are going to be inherently conservative values, small c conservative. But like, so you need to, like we, as a department, just rewrote our whole tenure and promotion document to like figure out how to like meaningfully encompass the work that's happening in the department. But we can do that because there's 7 of us.
I'm sorry, Dr. Matani had a question?
Oh, maybe go ahead.
Go ahead, that's okay, go ahead.
So this was great. I've learned so much. It was really interesting. I've both recently worked on a public humanities publication with UBC Press, which will shortly go to my department for merit consideration, that had a form of peer review. We'll see. That had a form of peer review that sort of split, was form-based as well as content-based. So this was really interesting. And I told you before that, so I edit a journal, and we're trying at the journal to think about how to make a space for scholars to submit basically the equivalent of an article in the form of a single podcast episode. So not a whole series, and we're not proposing to begin making podcasts at the journal, but basically to be a forum where they could, obviously maintaining the open access ethos, that seems to go without saying to me, of a podcast, that it would be something that would be peer reviewed. And so we're kind of actively thinking about what kind of people we're SSHRC funded, so we're sort of also like what would be still acceptable to SSHRC, because they require us to like publish a certain number of peer review pieces per issue. And so I guess I have like so many things I could ask. One thing I'm wondering that I've been playing around with a little bit in my mind is whether there's a potential new relationship between the print article and a podcast, and not like an audio reading of the article, which our journal has also done in the past, but like if there's any, like I could imagine, although I don't know anybody who wants to do this, but I could imagine being interested in like having my scholarly article in the journal and then also publishing a type of public-facing podcast that drew upon, especially I work on oral history, so if you worked on oral history, you could like make this wonderful podcast. But I don't know, I'm just curious about what you think about that potential relationship, if you think that's generative, or if it's, I could also see downsides to it of like keeping it hitched to the academic article.
Yeah, and what we've tried really hard with this collaboration with WULLUP, that's what we like to call it. Everybody who works at Wilfrid Laurier University Press hates that, but I like to call it WULLUP. That we have tried not to hitch the podcast to a written form because there is already so much a tendency to say, here's the real thing, and then here's the fun addendum that you've added, and we'll evaluate the real thing, and cite the real thing, and credit the real thing, and then say neat to the added experimental thing, right? And this sort of continues like this accreditation logic, right? To accredit my experimental work, I need to hitch it to something that is more familiar. And I think that does make sense, especially when we're in the early days of figuring out whether something can count as scholarship. I don't think we're in the early days anymore with podcasting. I think we're ready to go more experimental than that. And so we have tried to say, like, the podcast does not need a written supplement. The podcast is the scholarship itself. It's not, and also to sort of de-hitch that logic of like, here's my real research and here's the mobilization of that research, which is what I mean when I say public first scholarship, right? That the publicly mobilized thing I do is the scholarship itself. And so what I would be really interested in rather is like, make an article that's audio, like just publish experimental audio pieces and say like, here, this is scholarship. This counts. It makes its arguments differently, it looks different, but we can, like, on an open digital platform, you can absolutely publish it, no problem. And, can you find people who will peer review it? Probably. Yeah, sound study scholars.
Yeah, so that is for sure what we're going to try and do. And I think I've been thinking about whether we would, like, also give authors this opportunity to have multiple forms, but I think what you just said makes me like doing that makes it seem like risks has too many risks associated of it making it of degrading the audio portion, so maybe we.
What I have seen, which I think is interesting, which is a thing that sound studies scholars do, is sort of multimodal publishing that incorporates text and sound scholarship together, where it will be like, here's some text, now here's an audio clip, now here's some more text, now here's an audio clip, where like, in order to engage with it, you have to sort of go through the whole thing, and that is quite common in sound studies, because a lot of the time what people are doing is like creating a sort of sound object of some variety and then theorizing it. And you see that sort of creative critical production happens sort of in some versions of media studies, like film as well. And then I can never remember the name of it, but there is an experimental film journal where all of the submissions are film-based, so it's people making film about film, and there is a short rationale published alongside the film. That's just like a little, like the writer sort of explains what they're doing a little bit, but it's the film itself that is the scholarship. So I do think there are ways to sort of bring text and sound together that are not necessarily, also like, it would be really cool if journals had like an audiobook function so that you could listen to a journal article while you were walking your dog. We would have to write better journal articles for that to work. But that's a different question.
Did you have a question?
And I thought that was amazing. Thank you so much. I just appreciate everything about what you do, but also the way you present is so great. So thank you so much for this. I'm totally in awe of the way that you're like shifting the scholarship for all of us within the Academy. So
yeah, coming from Humanities, I don't buy it.
It can still be that's kind of this thing, right? Like you do buy it because you know what I do and why I feel this way. So I think it's really important to say up front. I do have a nuts and bolts question, which is how the hell are you pulling this off? Like the reviewer said, because I want to know about like how you actually do this every week. Like, what app do you use to record it? And like the nuts and bolts interest me. Like, do you use Anchor? And then how do you actually do the editing? Do you have like, what app do you use for that?
So my recording setup is a Zoom H5, so a portable audio recorder, because it's really important to me to be able to go and interview people wherever. And then I use dynamic microphones that I plug in, which are sort of like a microphone that you would be used to seeing on stage, rather than a lot of podcasters use condenser microphones, which are like the huge ones, but you have to use those in proper sound baffled studios. And for me, mobility is really a priority. So I've got a little sort of mobile, can throw it in my backpack and go set up. And then once I've recorded my audio, I edit using Hindenburg, which is a lovely audio editing suite created by a guy named Chris who lives in Belgium.
And you know this because?
Because I email Chris a lot. I'm like, hey Chris, I need some more like educational licenses for Hindenburg, and he's like, yeah, Hannah, no problem, but it's Friday night here and I'm on parental duty, so I'll get back to you on Monday. And I'm like, thanks Chris. I really like Chris and I really like Hindenburg. Hindenburg was a custom-built tool for editing podcasts. So it has it's exactly as much machine as you need, not like Audition, which is the Adobe Suite audio editor, I find wildly intimidating. And I mostly make podcasts as part of my work now. So this is sort of what the basic editing, this is a Secret Feminist Agenda episode, and what you're seeing here is that's my intro, these are some little music cues, and then these are the two voice tracks, me and the guest. I would say sort of a standard, a mini-sode episode, so I just released a mini-sode, they're the short ones that are just me, that I release in between interviews, and those take me probably 2 to 3 hours to produce beginning to end. To sit down, record something, edit it, get it up, it's an afternoon of work. So I'm doing that once a month, right? 3 hours once a month, whatever, we can do that. And then the interview episodes obviously take longer. So I'd say probably between finding the guest, interviewing the guest, and then editing the episode, probably maybe 8 hours of work per episode. So it's less work. This kind of, because it is an interview-based podcast, with quite light editing, where I'm just trying to sort of clean it up and make it as listenable as possible. It's fairly light. And that's because I designed Secret Feminist Agenda as a project to be as low production labor as possible, based on the experience of making Witch Please, which is a wild amount of work. Witch Please we would often record for like 4 hours and then have to edit it down to an hour and a half. We had sound effects all the way through because it made the show more whimsical. But so a single episode of Witch Please often took 12 to 16 hours to produce. So when I started making Secret Feminist Agenda, I was like, well, that's not happening. But this is because it's interview podcasts, right? So they are quite production light, comparatively speaking. I'm working right now on an episode of, here it is, the Spoken Web podcast, where I interviewed 2 people and I'm sort of editing those interviews together with my own narration and archival audio to sort of tell a story. And that so far has been like probably 3 or 4 hours of interview time, and then probably another, then I ran the interviews through transcription software, and then I spent maybe another 4 or 5 hours rereading the interviews, highlighting the parts I wanted to use, cutting those parts out, and manually storyboarding how I wanted the thing to fit together, and then maybe another hour writing the rest of my script around that, maybe half hour to record my script, and then in terms of editing labor so far, I'd say it's been probably 5 or 6 hours of editing so far for this episode. So this kind of podcast is way more labor intensive because it is that kind of like what you might recognize from a kind of like Radio Lab mode that's like telling story through sound. I could never do an episode like this on a weekly basis. Like it would have to be my full-time job. I mean, it's multiple people's full-time jobs. That's how people produce these. So, it has to do with the kind of thing that you're making. Yeah.
So, sorry.
Yeah.
No, it's just because it's kind of a follow-up to that. So this episode will be how long when it's finished?
40 minutes?
40 minutes.
35 maybe?
Yeah. And then you just gave us all the hours, but in total, how much would you?
Well, it's not done yet, but I would say 35 to 40 minute episode, and it will end up being maybe 20 hours work.
Right. Okay. Thank you.
But so that's like, think about it in comparison to like writing an article. Yeah. Like, I can write an article in 20 hours. Is that wild? I can write an article in 20 hours. Sure. But that's not, like, again, it's like, how are we counting the work? Like, this episode in particular is about Gwendolyn McEwen, who is a poet who I know really, really well. I was really familiar with the archival work already. I was familiar with the scholarship. I was interviewing other scholars about their work. So, like, I'm not adding in the research time. I don't know, it's good because I had already done the research and the scholars had already done the research. So, like, if you cut the research time out, you can write an article in 20 hours. Like, if I added the research hours into this, then I don't know, 1,000? Like, how do we count research hours?
Right.
Yeah.
I hate to draw this to a close, but we do have to clear out of this room for the next purpose of the room. Just want you to join me in thanking Hannah for an amazing presentation. Thank you.